The path to justice for black people has many roads and many turns, and this story represents that. On the surface, it's a story about an injustice that happened to a black boy. But when you dig deeper into it, you realize that this boy's story and what happened to him were part of a larger story that we are all familiar with. Because what happened to Jeremiah Reeves in 1955 was the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. I'm going to talk about a few things in this video, but if you stick with me to the end, you will see why this is an important story and why it must be told. Before I get into what happened to Jeremiah, I have to give you some historical context first. So give me a few moments to talk about this to set the stage for Jeremiah's story. 1955 was a very important year for black people in America. It was the year Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. This led to a Montgomery bus boycott and the rise of a young preacher who was new in town named Martin Luther King Jr. Long before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, black residents of Montgomery faced constant mistreatment on these segregated buses, from being forced to stand over empty seats to arrests and assaults and harassment, particularly targeting black women and black children. In 1950, a black veteran named Hilliard Brooks lost his life after police fatally fired at him when he cursed a bus driver who refused to let him ride the bus. No one was ever held accountable. In 1953, a black woman named Epsie Worthy was beaten by a Montgomery bus driver when she refused to pay the driver for a second transfer ticket after she explained that she had already purchased one. So by the time that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on December 1st, 1955, black people had already been wanting to boycott. We think of that as the beginning of the civil rights movement, but the movement almost started 9 months earlier in March of 1955. In 1955, Claudette Colvin was a 15-year-old student at Booker T. Washington High School in Montgomery, Alabama. Booker T. Washington High School was a premier school in Montgomery for black students. It was started during Reconstruction in the late 1800s. Through donations and through petitions and labor for generations, the local black community helped to make it a shining example of what a black school could be in the Jim Crow South. The students were well taught by well-educated black teachers who cared for them and prepared them to challenge the Jim Crow world they lived in. On March 2nd, 1955, Claudette was on a Montgomery bus when the white section was full of white people. Claudette was seated in the middle section of the bus that separated the white and the black sections. This section was known as the no man's land. The bus driver ordered the black people seated there to get up so that white people who came on the bus could sit down. Claudette refused. The bus driver called the police. The police came and handcuffed Claudette and dragged her off of the bus. She fought them every step of the way. Claudette was arrested for violating Montgomery bus segregation laws. They also charged her with assault and disorderly conduct. E.D. Nixon was the head of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP. He had been wanting to challenge the laws in Alabama for a long time. He got together with a young lawyer named Fred Gray and got him to represent Claudette. They decided to use Claudette's case to attack segregation in the courts. The NAACP had planned to use her case to challenge segregation in Montgomery. However, when Claudette became pregnant, the plan was put aside. NAACP leaders feared that Claudette, being an unwed teenager, would hamper the organization's plan to present a respectable black person as the face of the movement. But attorney Fred Gray did continue with Claudette's legal case to challenge segregation in Montgomery on the buses. Claudette's case is very important. She worked with the NAACP to test the legality of bus segregation laws in Alabama. Claudette was also one of the plaintiffs in the 1956 case called Browder v. Gale. This was a U.S. Supreme Court case that struck down segregation on buses in Montgomery. The Supreme Court said that Montgomery's segregated buses violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So it wasn't Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat and the Montgomery bus boycott that ended bus segregation. It was a U.S. Supreme Court case of Browder v. Gale. The 381-day boycott against segregation on the buses ended because of a Supreme Court case that was started because Claudette Colvin decided to protest Jim Crow and bus segregation. You're probably thinking, why is he telling me this? Well, because one of the reasons Claudette took the courageous act of refusing to give up her seat that day was because she was upset about how her school classmate was treated. The classmate that I'm referring to is the black boy who I'm going to tell you about for the rest of this video. It was what happened to Jeremiah Reeves in Montgomery, Alabama that was one of the reasons that fueled Claudette's passion to stand up for herself that day. And in many ways, what happened to Jeremiah is one of the many sparks that led to the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s that ended racial segregation in America. Jeremiah Reeves Jr. was born in 1936 to Carnella and Jeremiah Reeves Sr. His mother was a homemaker and his father was a preacher and a delivery driver. He was described as a nice kid. He played the drums in a jazz band, and he was also described as a child who who suffered from some mental delays and mental deficiencies. In 1952, his world ended when he was arrested and charged with a crime that many believe that he did not commit. On November 10, 1952, 16-year-old Jeremiah was arrested and accused of attacking and violating a 30-year-old white woman named Mabel Crowder in her home. However, it was said by everyone in town that Jeremiah was having a consensual relationship with Mabel. And I cautiously use the word consensual because Jeremiah was a child and Mabel was a grown woman. So really, this adult white woman was taking advantage of a black child. Jeremiah was arrested on his way to school, the same school that Claudette Colvin attended. After he was arrested, he was immediately taken to Kilby Prison. Sheriff George Mosley and Deputy Warren ORDs took Jeremiah to the death chamber where the electric chair was. They strapped him to the chair and accused him of attacking 6 white women in Montgomery County. This went on for 3 days. They made him sit in the electric chair and question him over and over again about attacking multiple white women. He was not allowed to see his parents or talk to a lawyer. They told Jeremiah that he can get out of the chair if he confessed and told them what they wanted to hear. The police were familiar with Jeremiah Reeves. He wasn't just a random person that they came across. They had arrested him in June of 1952 after he was accused of entering 3 stores and stealing money. At the time, several white women had been attacked in their homes, and the police had yet to solve these crimes. There was tremendous pressure on the police to make a break in the case, and Jeremiah was the perfect person to blame it on. They believed that Jeremiah was the Monday marauder who had been attacking white women, and the police quickly pointed the finger at Jeremiah. After 3 days of intense questioning and threatening, Jeremiah could not take it anymore, and he confessed to committing the robberies of the white women. Jeremiah allegedly confessed to the crime and said that when he came to Mabel Crowder's home, he knocked on the door and she answered it. He then attacked her and took $6 from her. Mabel Crowder told the police that Jeremiah tried to violate her and he beat her, and when she resisted, he then robbed her. Police claimed that Jeremiah was identified by 2 victims and signed 6 separate confession statements about the attacks he committed over a 16-month period between July of 1951 and November of 1952, when he was around 14 to 15 years of age. The alleged victims were shown copies of the confession statements that Jeremiah signed before they identified him at the police station. Police said that Jeremiah said that he used taxi cabs to get home after he attacked the white women. After Jeremiah was arrested, the grand jury convened to investigate his alleged crimes. And 5 days later, Jeremiah was indicted by the grand jury on 6 counts of robbery, violating a white woman, and attempting to violate a white woman. The black community in Montgomery saw this as a rush to blame a black child for a crime that the police could not solve. Jim Crow did not wait to serve up his punishment on Jeremiah, though. His trial was rushed to start 2 weeks later. Jeremiah was represented by attorney John N. McGee. The prosecutor was William Thetford. The trial started on November 26, 1955. Before the trial began, attorney McGee filed a pretrial motion challenging the jury composition. He said that the way the jury pool was chosen excluded black people. Attorney McGee subpoenaed the judge on Jeremiah's case, Judge Eugene Carter, to testify about this issue. Judge Carter was the same judge that would later preside over Claudette Colvin's case. Judge Carter sat on the commission that chose jury pools in Montgomery. Judge Carter had to step down from the trial as a result of this. Another judge, Judge James Carter, was appointed to replace him. The prosecution called several witnesses at the trial. Jeremiah testified in his own defense. Jeremiah was on the witness stand for about 46 minutes at his trial. Jeremiah said that the only reason he confessed was because they told him he could avoid the electric chair if he said that he attacked the white women. Jeremiah's attorney's defense was 2-pronged. First, that Jeremiah was not guilty of the crimes he was accused of. And second, that he was not guilty by reason of insanity because Jeremiah was known to be a child who was mentally delayed. The consensual relationship that Jeremiah and Mabel Crowder were believed to be having was not mentioned at the trial at all. I know what some of you are probably thinking. You're thinking to yourself, if he was having a consensual relationship with Mabel Crowder, why not just say that? Some of you are asking, why would he plead not guilty by reason of insanity? Well, you have to remember, this is 1952 in Alabama. This was 2 years before Dr. King even arrived in Alabama, and 3 years before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, which started the Montgomery bus boycott. This was 2 years before the Supreme Court decided the case of Brown versus the Board of Education and ended segregation in public schools. You can't apply any of that knowledge you have about the civil rights movement to Jeremiah's case because it had not happened yet. This was Jim Crow Alabama in the early 1950s. This was a time when black people received no justice and no one cared about what happened to black people. Why Jeremiah chose to say one thing over another and why his attorney chose to litigate the case one way or another must be filtered through that lens and not your current understanding about the civil rights struggles of today or almost 100 years ago. And It can't be filtered through what you believe you would have done, because this was a time when they would drag black people from the courtroom and lynch them on the courthouse lawn. Or even worse, many times the black people will be lynched in the courtroom. Jeremiah's attorney highlighted for the jury how inconsistent the police were in claiming that Jeremiah was the attacker of multiple white women. Through the questioning of witnesses, he pointed out how Jeremiah had been arrested once before after 5 of the 6 attacks they claimed he committed had occurred, and police released Jeremiah after none of the victims were able to identify Jeremiah as their attacker. And Jeremiah had an alibi for when the police claimed that he attacked Mabel Crowder. A neighbor of Jeremiah's testified that Jeremiah had spent the day with her playing dominoes when the attack allegedly occurred. Mabel Crowder testified at the trial. She said that she was sitting at her dresser on July 28, 1952, when she looked up in the mirror and saw Jeremiah standing in the doorway. She said that he attacked her and he beat her. Jeremiah's trial was a sham from the start. Black people were intentionally excluded from the jury pool, and it was revealed by Jeremiah's attorney that one of the jurors chosen for the trial was the chief of the Montgomery Reserve Police Force. Attorney McGee moved for a mistrial after he discovered this, but the judge denied this request. After hearing all of the evidence, the all-white jury deliberated for 38 minutes. The jury found Jeremiah guilty. The judge sentenced him to death by electrocution on January 23, 1952. As the verdict was being read, Jeremiah stared, confused, at his mother, not knowing what had happened. Days after Jeremiah was found guilty, the mood for revenge was so strong in the area that a black veteran named John Smith was chased 20 miles and fired at by white men trying to capture him. One farmer said that he wanted to take Smith's life but couldn't get close enough to him. Another said that the Reeves case was what prompted them to chase Smith. Jim Crow had won when it convicted Jeremiah Reeves, but the battle was far from over. The fight to save his life was only beginning. Claudette Colvin said that black youth at Washington High School were angered by Jeremiah's arrest and conviction and wanted to do something to help him. The NAACP hired lawyers to defend Jeremiah. This is when Claudette Colvin first heard of the NAACP. Claudette and her friends decided to show movies and take donations to help with Jeremiah's legal fees. Jeremiah's case was appealed to the Alabama Supreme Court, and his appeal was denied in December of 1953. His execution date was set for January 22, 1954. NAACP lawyers mounted a strong defense to save Jeremiah's life. They appealed his case to the U.S. Supreme Court. Jeremiah was represented by NAACP lawyers Orzel Billingsley, Peter Hall, Thurgood Marshall, and attorney Jack Greenberg. In June of 1954, the Supreme Court agreed to review Jeremiah's case. The NAACP lawyers argued that Jeremiah was 16 with an 8th grade education level, and when he was arrested, he was held for 3 days and subjected to coercive police tactics designed to make him confess. They said that the police violated Jeremiah's constitutional rights. They also argued that the trial judge was wrong not to allow the jury to hear how Jeremiah's confessions were obtained. In December of 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed Jeremiah's conviction and ordered a new trial. This was a small victory, but it did not last long, because the state of Alabama was still determined to try, convict, and execute Jeremiah Reeves. Jeremiah's second trial began on March 28, 1955. Jeremiah was 19 years old when the case went to trial for the second time. William Thetford prosecuted the case again for the state. Judge James Carter was brought back again to preside over the case. Jeremiah was represented by a team of black lawyers this time. Peter Hall, Orzel Billingsley, Fred Gray, and Charles Langford represented Jeremiah. Attorney Gray also represented Claudette Colvin. Attorney Hall had began the trial by moving for a mistrial on the grounds that the jury pool process had excluded black people. That request was denied by Judge Carter. Jeremiah's attorneys once again presented the theory that Jeremiah was not guilty and called into question his sanity to stand trial. His attorneys filed a motion with the judge to have Jeremiah committed to the Alabama State Hospital for a competency exam and to continue his trial until that exam was completed. The judge denied this motion. Jeremiah testified at his second trial, and so did his mother and also Mabel Crowder. After 2 days of testimony from witnesses, the case went to the jury. The prosecutor asked the jury to find Jeremiah guilty and to give him the death penalty. The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 17 minutes. On June 2, 1955, Jeremiah was found guilty again, with no recommendation of mercy. Judge Carter sentenced Jeremiah to die by electrocution. His execution date was set for August 12, 1955. Jeremiah's attorneys tried once more to save his life by filing a motion for a new trial with the judge, but Judge Carter denied that motion. They then appealed his case to the Alabama Supreme Court in January of 1956, but the court also confirmed his conviction. After that, Jeremiah's attorneys appealed his conviction all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court once again. Only this time, the Supreme Court upheld Jeremiah's conviction in June of 1956. After this, Jeremiah's fate was in the hands of Alabama Governor James Folsom. The only way Jeremiah would be spared the death chamber was by being granted clemency from the governor. In March of 1958, Jeremiah's attorneys were able to secure a clemency hearing before the governor of Alabama to try to convince him that Jeremiah's life should be spared. Jeremiah's attorneys presented evidence that he was coerced into confessing and that the trial was unfair. This all fell on deaf ears. Late on the night of March 27th, Governor Folsom said that he would not intervene and that Jeremiah Reeves would die by electrocution. On March 28, 1958, 22-year-old Jeremiah Reeves was walked into the death chamber. He was strapped into the electric chair, and at 12:01 a.m., he was executed. Jeremiah carried a small Bible to the electric chair with him. His last words were a message to his mother. He then said that he was ready. Hundreds of people attended Jeremiah's funeral. So many people came out that some had to stand outside on lawns and porches of neighboring homes because there were so many people who wanted to pay their respects to Jeremiah that day. Black people were very upset by the unfair prosecution and execution of Jeremiah Reeves. They held a protest on Easter Day in 1958 at the Alabama State Capitol. They distributed leaflets to announce the protest. Black people saw what happened to Jeremiah as another miscarriage of justice that Jim Crow was inflicting on black people. The leaflet said that the laws in Alabama were administered around white people and that black people should use the tragic death of Jeremiah Reeves as a challenge to demand the right to vote in Alabama. Local papers spoke out against the rally and the NAACP for what they considered to be meddling in Alabama's affairs. In anticipation of the rally, opposers sprayed the streets with signs of the Klan. By this time, Dr. King was pastoring the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery and had successfully led the Montgomery bus boycott. He was a national figure. Jeremiah's case had caught Dr. King's attention after Dr. King first arrived in Montgomery. After the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, the Montgomery Improvement Association, also known as the MIA, which was the organization that was formed to lead and support the boycott, they used their financial resources to aid community projects and court cases. One of the cases they supported was the Jeremiah Reeves case. The NAACP had traditionally assisted financially with legal cases where black people were victims of Jim Crow justice. But in 1956, the state of Alabama had taken an unusual step and banned the NAACP from operating in Alabama. Alabama said that the NAACP was not properly registered with the Secretary of State. Southern states had done this to the NAACP as retaliation for organizing and fighting for the rights of black people. The same thing had happened in Louisiana and in South Carolina and in Georgia and in Texas. This greatly hampered their ability to step in and support court cases where they were important to the cause of civil rights and racial justice in America. The MIA stepped in to fill this void. The MIA gave more than $1,000 to support the Jeremiah Reeves case. Dr. King even wrote about Jeremiah's case in his book, Stride Toward Freedom. So when the Easter protest was organized, Dr. King made sure that he was there. Shortly after 2 p.m. on Easter Sunday, Dr. King led 15 black ministers on a one-block procession from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where he pastored, to the state capitol, where he spoke to a waiting crowd of over 2,000 black people. Dr. King led a prayer pilgrimage and spoke to the crowd. Dr. King believed that Jeremiah's case was typical of how black people were treated in Alabama and really most of the Jim Crow South. Dr. King spoke about how Jeremiah was treated unfairly and how the criminal justice system had worked against Jeremiah because he was black. Dr. King talked about how the criminal justice system targeted black people for harsher penalties for crimes that white people were rarely held accountable for. Dr. Martin Luther King said that grown men had done similar things to little black girls and black women and were rarely punished and were never given the death penalty or even a life sentence like Jeremiah Reeves was. During the years that Jeremiah sat in prison, a number of white men in Alabama were accused of similar crimes against black women and black girls. These men were rarely arrested and were cleared by all white grand juries. None were ever brought to trial. Dr. King's remarks at the Capitol that day are very powerful. If you have time, I encourage you to read what he said. You can read his speech on my site. We've included the full text of his remarks there. Dr. King was not just speaking about what happened decades ago. His words still ring true today for the kind of injustices that black people still face. Days later, a group of white clergy and church leaders issued a statement denouncing Dr. King, the black ministers, and the Easter demonstration on Jeremiah's behalf. They said that black leaders should instead have a dialogue with white leaders. Dr. King and the Montgomery Improvement Association issued a public reply accepting the white minister's invitation for a discussion, but they received no response at all from them. The Jeremiah Reeves case was not just about a black teen being accused of attacking a white woman. It was much bigger than that. You have to put it in context with what was going on at the time. 1955 was a turning point in the modern civil rights movement. It saw Dr. King rise to the national stage and lead the Montgomery bus boycott, and Rosa Parks become the face of a movement to end racial segregation in America. The Reeves case was just a reminder to white Southerners of just how important it was to publicly fight for segregation, and it was also a reminder to black people of what was at stake in this fight. Jim Crow had to fall, and black people had to demand their right to vote and for enfranchisement and for equal rights and equal protection, or they risk facing the same fate as Jeremiah by becoming victims of an unjust system that did not care about their rights or black people's humanity. In many ways, Jeremiah Reeves and what happened to him was one of the catalysts that started the modern civil rights movement. Without the injustice of what happened to Jeremiah Reeves, Claudette Colvin might not have refused to give up her seat that day on that bus. And without Claudette Colvin's case, we would not have had the Supreme Court case that outlaws segregation on the buses. And we may not have had the rise of Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, Rosa Parks said that Jeremiah Reeves' case greatly affected her. Mrs. Parks wrote to Jeremiah in jail and even helped Jeremiah to get his poetry published. And that is why his story is so important and why his story must never be forgotten. I want to know your thoughts on this video. Had you ever heard of the story of Jeremiah Reeves, and how did it make you feel learning all that he went through? And did you know his connection to the modern civil rights movement? Drop me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.